The king believed she was faithless, and that belief was a chasm no bridge of truth could span. It was a conviction that had settled in the marrow of his ancient bones, cold and hard as the black marble of his throne. He did not shout. The silence was his weapon, a suffocating void that pressed in on Alara from all sides, more terrible than any rage. 6 days the silence had reigned, a kingdom of its own within the castle walls, and now it had finally been given a name: betrayal. "You will be gone by morning," Kale said. His voice was not the one he used for her in the quiet hours after midnight, the low timbre that felt like velvet against her skin. This was the voice of the Vampire King, the voice that had commanded armies and passed judgment on immortals for 1,000 years. It was flat, devoid of heat, a blade sharpened by an eternity of disappointment. Alara stood before him in the cavernous throne room, the distance between them a vast, uncrossable tundra. The twin hearths at either end of the hall threw flickering, monstrous shadows that danced on the tapestries depicting his bloody victories. She had always hated these tapestries. Now, she felt like one of the conquered figures woven into the threads, her life's color draining away under his gaze. Her hands were clasped before her, the knuckles white. She could feel the frantic, bird-like flutter of her own heart against her ribs, a desperate, living thing trapped in the frozen landscape of his certainty. She did not ask for proof. She did not ask for the name of her accuser. She did not weep or plead or throw herself at his feet to beg for a clemency he had already decided she did not deserve. To do so would be to accept the premise of his question, to engage in a debate where her guilt was the foregone conclusion. Her innocence was not a commodity to be bartered for. It was a fact. If he could not see it, if the 5 years they had shared were not proof enough, then no torrent of words, no storm of tears could ever convince him. His trust had been a fragile, glass-spun thing, and he had just shattered it against the stone floor of his own paranoia. So she simply held his gaze. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a storm, held no trace of the man who had traced the lines of her palm and whispered that her lifeline was now intertwined with his. They were the eyes of a stranger, a monarch entombed in his own power. The pain of it was a physical blow, a pressure building behind her sternum so immense she feared she might splinter apart. She thought, this is how it ends. Not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of a door. She could feel the eyes of the court on her, hidden in the shadowed alcoves and behind the great pillars. She could feel their whispers, venomous and triumphant. They had never wanted her here, the mortal girl with a beating heart who had captured the king's attention. They had seen her as a weakness, a temporary diversion. In his condemnation, their world was righting itself. The anomaly was being excised. Kale sat upon the obsidian throne, his long-fingered hands resting on the snarling gargoyles carved into the arms. He was magnificent in his cold fury, a creature of terrible, inhuman beauty. A fine tremor ran through his left hand, the only sign of the emotion he held so rigidly in check. He was waiting. Waiting for her to break, to give him the catharsis of her denial, the drama of her defense. It would feed his narrative, confirm his righteous anger. Alara would not give it to him. She gave him nothing. With a slowness that felt both deliberate and dreamlike, she lowered her head in a gesture that was not submission, but an ending. A final, formal acknowledgement of his station and the unbridgeable gulf it had always represented. She had been a guest in his world, a visitor to his eternity, and her visa had just been irrevocably revoked. Then, she turned her back on the throne, on the king, on the life she had believed was hers. The sound of her soft-soled shoes on the polished stone was the only noise in the vast hall. Each footstep was a lifetime. The first, a memory of their first meeting, his surprise at her lack of fear. The second, the night he'd first touched her, his hand so cold it seemed to burn. The third, laughing together in the snow-dusted gardens, his rare, genuine smile a gift more precious than any jewel. Step after step, a funeral procession for a love she now understood had only ever been real to her. She did not look back. To look back would be to turn to salt, to freeze forever in a state of longing for a thing that was already ash. The immense, bronze-chased doors at the far end of the hall seemed a mile away. Her walk was a pilgrimage toward her own exile. The air grew colder as she moved away from the hearths, a premonition of the world that awaited her outside these suffocatingly warm walls. She reached the doors, and the 2 royal guards standing sentinel, their faces impassive stone, did not move to stop her. They pulled the heavy doors open. A gust of damp, cold air swirled in, carrying the scent of rain and wet earth. It was the smell of freedom, and it smelled exactly like grief. She stepped through the doorway and did not falter as the doors boomed shut behind her, the sound echoing like the final beat of a dying heart. Cale remained on the throne, the echo of the closing doors vibrating in the hollow of his chest. The silence she had left behind was different from the one he had curated. His had been a weapon. Hers was a void, an absence that was more powerful than any presence. He stared at the spot where she had stood, half expecting her image to be burned into the marble, a ghostly afterimage of her stillness. He had expected tears, hysterics, a passionate defense that he could have systematically dismantled. He had prepared for a storm. He had not prepared for the quiet dignity of a cloudless sky. Her lack of a fight was, to his ancient and suspicious mind, the most damning evidence of all. An innocent creature would have raged, would have clawed and fought for her life, for her love. Her composure felt like the cold calculation of someone with nothing left to lose because it had all been a game to begin with. The whispers of his court solidified into truth in the vacuum of her silence. Lord Valerus had seen her, laughing in the city market with the visiting human envoy, her hand resting on his arm for a moment too long. Lady Seraphina had found a man's linen scarf, plain, common, decidedly not of the castle, tucked into the cushions of a divan in the conservatory, a place Alara often went to read. It was nothing. It was everything. For a being who had lived 10 centuries, who had seen empires rise from dust and return to it, who had learned that betrayal was the currency of both mortals and immortals, suspicion was a reflex. Love, for him, had not been a gentle dawning. It had been a siege. Alara, with her earnest gaze and her laughter that sounded like wind chimes, had breached walls he hadn't even known were still standing. He had allowed her into the innermost keep of his desiccated heart, and this vulnerability was a constant, low-grade terror. The moment he heard the rumors, that terror had flared into a defensive, preemptive strike. He would cast her out before she could abandon him. He would burn the fortress down himself before he would let the enemy take it. He rose from the throne, his movements stiff. The throne room felt impossibly large now, impossibly empty. The shadows seemed to mock him. He stalked from the dais, his boots silent on the stone. He needed to feel something other than this cold, hollow victory. His gaze fell upon a pedestal near the hearth, where a crystal vase stood, filled with the white moonroses she loved. He had had them brought from the southern mountains, a difficult and costly endeavor, just to see her smile. The memory was an irritant, a flaw in the perfection of his rage. With a snarl that was purely animal, he swept the vase from the pedestal. It flew across the room and shattered against a far wall, the explosion of crystal and water a sudden, satisfying violence in the crushing quiet. Shards rained down onto the floor, glittering like fallen stars. The white petals of the moonroses were scattered, bruised and dying, on the cold stone. For a moment, he felt a surge of power, the familiar comfort of destruction. But it faded almost instantly, leaving behind the same gnawing emptiness, now littered with the evidence of his own brutishness. He stared at the mess, at the broken flowers, and saw not his strength, but his failure. He had demanded absolute faith from her while offering none of his own. He had tested her love with the one thing it could not survive, his own bottomless distrust. He left the throne room, leaving the shattered vase and the dead flowers for the servants to clean. He strode through the corridors of his castle, a ghost in his own home. Every room held a memory of her. Here, in the great library, she had fallen asleep in an armchair, a heavy book of lore slipping from her fingers, her face soft and unguarded in the firelight. He had watched her for an hour, terrified and fascinated by the peace she carried within her. There, on the balcony overlooking the sleeping city, she had taught him the names of the mortal constellations, her finger tracing the patterns in the sky, her breath a small white cloud in the cold night air. His world had been shades of black and grey and crimson for so long, and she had painted it, piece by piece, with color. Now, he had willfully plunged it back into darkness. He found himself outside her chambers. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was neat, orderly, but it was already losing her. Her scent, a subtle mix of chamomile, old paper, and the clean smell of rain, was fading, being consumed by the sterile, dusty air of the castle. He saw that she had not ransacked the place. The gowns he had commissioned, shimmering silks and velvets, still hung in the wardrobe. The jewel box on her vanity was closed, its contents untouched. A wave of something akin to confusion washed over him. A faithless lover, a mercenary heart, would have taken the spoils. They would have stripped the room bare, taking every coin, every gem, every tangible proof of their conquest. His eyes scanned the room, searching for, he didn't know what. A confession. A clue. A justification for the gaping wound in his chest. And then he saw it. On the small writing desk by the window, a single object remained. It was a small wooden bird, crudely carved, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. He had carved it for her himself, one long, boring afternoon centuries ago, before he was king, before his hands had become tools for signing edicts and wielding power. He had found it in a dusty chest and given it to her on a whim. She had treasured it, keeping it on her bedside table. Now it sat in the center of the desk, a solitary, silent accusation. She had taken nothing of value, nothing of the king's. She had only left behind a gift from the man. The distinction was a blade twisting in his gut. He had not just banished a consort. He had murdered the part of himself she had loved. Ilara did not take the gowns of spun moonlight or the slippers of softest doeskin. She did not take the necklaces that dripped diamonds like frozen tears or the pearls that glowed with a soft, internal luminescence. Her life at court had been a costume drama, and she refused to leave with the props. She packed a single, worn leather satchel. A change of sturdy wool clothes, a small loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese from the kitchens, a waterskin. Her fingers, moving with an unnatural calm, brushed against the velvet-lined jewelry box Cale had given her. She opened it, for a moment, and stared at the glittering hoard within. They were beautiful, cold, and utterly meaningless. They were payment for a service, she now realized. The service of her time, her affection, her warmth. She closed the lid with a soft click. She moved through the suite of rooms that had been her gilded cage. The air was thick with memories, each one a fresh torment. The sitting room, with its deep, plush couches where they had read to each other, his voice a low rumble, her head resting on his chest, feeling the strange, still silence where a heartbeat should have been. The balcony, where they had watched thunderstorms roll in over the mountains, the lightning illuminating his face, making him look like a god of old. Every object was imbued with a ghost. The silver hairbrush on the vanity. The cashmere throw draped over a chair. The half-finished tapestry on its loom, a pattern of forest flowers she had been weaving. She ran her hand over the threads, the vibrant greens and blues a stark contrast to the grey emptiness inside her. She could not finish it now. It would remain a testament to an interrupted life. Her final choice was the most painful. On her bedside table, beside a book of poetry, sat the small, carved wooden bird. It was rough, imperfect, the knife marks still visible in the dark wood. Cale had given it to her during their first winter together. "I made this when I was a boy," he'd confessed, a rare admission of a past that felt more human than immortal. Before all this he had meant the crown, the power, the centuries of solitude. She had held it in her palm, this small piece of his forgotten boyhood, and felt a rush of tenderness so fierce it had frightened her. It was the one thing in this entire castle that felt wholly real, wholly his. She picked it up. Its weight was negligible, but it felt impossibly heavy. To take it would be to carry a piece of her heartbreak with her, a constant, physical reminder of what she had lost. To leave it would be a lie, a pretense that it meant nothing. For a long moment, she stood, warring with herself. Then, with a quiet finality, she walked to the writing desk and placed the bird in the very center, its wings aimed toward the window, toward the world outside. Let him find it. Let it be her only message. You have kept the king, but you have lost the man who carved a bird. With the satchel over her shoulder, she walked out of the rooms and into the long, silent corridor. She passed servants who averted their eyes, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. They were his subjects. Their loyalty was to the throne, not to the king's discarded pet. She did not blame them. One face, however, held her gaze. It was old Elspeth, the head housekeeper, a woman with kind eyes and hands permanently chapped from work. As Elara passed, Elspeth made a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture, touching her own heart. It was a small, dangerous act of solidarity, and it was enough to make Elara's carefully constructed composure crack. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cold cheek. She inclined her head, a silent thank you, and kept walking before the crack could widen into a fissure. The main gates of the castle loomed before her. It was just past dawn, the sky a bruised purple and grey. A fine, persistent drizzle was falling, slicking the cobblestones of the courtyard. The air was cold, sharp in her lungs. The guards at the gate, clad in the king's black and silver, watched her approach. They knew. Of course, they knew. The castle was a body, and gossip was its blood, flowing into every corner. They did not move to bar her way. They simply watched as she, the woman who had entered 5 years ago in a carriage, lauded as the king's chosen, now walked out on foot with nothing but a sack on her back. She stepped over the threshold, from the manicured, controlled world of the vampire court into the messy, unpredictable world of mortals. The rain immediately began to soak her hair, plastering it to her scalp. The cold seeped into her cloak. She did not flinch from it. The physical discomfort was a welcome distraction, a grounding sensation against the unreality of the moment. She kept walking, down the long, winding road that led from the castle's peak to the city below. She did not look back. Every instinct screamed at her to turn, to see if he was watching from a window, to search for any sign of regret. But she starved that instinct, crushed it. Her dignity was the only thing she had left, the only possession she was carrying out of that place, and she would not surrender it for a final, painful glimpse of a life that was no longer hers. The city below was shrouded in mist, a ghost of a place. She was walking toward it, a ghost herself, leaving one haunting for another. The rain fell harder, washing the scent of the castle from her clothes, washing the tears from her face, washing away 5 years of a life that had, in the end, been built on sand. 4 days passed. Then a week. Cale moved through his eternity as he always had, a creature of routine and ritual. He held court, listened to petitions, passed sentences. He met with his war council, his spies, the ambassadors from the southern wolf clans. He drank the finest blood from crystal goblets and slept in the cold, silken sheets of his solitary bed. From the outside, the kingdom ran as it always had, a perfect, intricate clockwork of power. But on the inside, a gear had broken. A spring had snapped. The clock was ticking, but the time was wrong. Elara's absence was not a quiet emptiness. It was a roar. It was a physical weight in every room, a pressure against his temples. The castle, once a sanctuary of ordered silence, now felt cavernous and loud with her lack of presence. Her laughter no longer echoed in the gardens. The scent of the herbs she grew on her balcony no longer drifted through the open windows. The sound of her humming, a tuneless, cheerful sound she made when she was reading, was gone. He had thought her a small, mortal thing, a brief candle flame in his endless night. He had not realized that he had grown accustomed to her light, that he had begun to navigate his world by it. Now, stumbling in the familiar dark, he found himself lost. His temper, always a tightly leashed beast, began to fray. He snapped at a minister for a minor error in a trade ledger. He dismissed a petitioner with a wave of his hand before the man had even finished speaking. He found fault in everything. The wine was too sweet, the fire was too low, the shadows in the corner of the room were too deep. His court, ever sensitive to the barometric pressure of his moods, grew tense and silent. They walked on eggshells, their whispers ceasing the moment he entered a room. They had gotten what they wanted, the mortal was gone, but the king's displeasure was a far more dangerous thing to live with. One evening, unable to bear the oppressive stillness of his chambers, he went to the library. This had been her favorite place. She had called it the castle's heart. He'd found the sentiment foolish. It was a repository of knowledge, nothing more. But now, standing among the towering shelves, breathing in the scent of old paper and leather, he felt a pang so sharp it made him catch his breath. He ran a hand along a row of spines, his fingers tracing the gilded titles. His hand stopped on a slim volume of human poetry. He pulled it from the shelf. It fell open to a page marked with a pressed blossom, a wild violet. Her favorite. A line was underlined in faint pencil. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds. He slammed the book shut, the sound a crack of thunder in the silence. He shoved it back onto the shelf, but the words were seared into his mind. Which alters when it alteration finds. His love, if it had ever been worthy of the name, had not just altered, it had evaporated at the first whisper of a challenge. It had been a conditional thing, a fair-weather affection that demanded perfect, unwavering adoration while offering suspicion in return. He was haunted. Not by her ghost, she was alive, somewhere out in the world he had thrown her into, but by the memory of her face in those final moments. The utter lack of surprise. The deep, quiet sorrow. The shattering of her heart had been a silent thing, and he had watched it happen, the architect of her pain. He replayed the scene again and again, searching for the flicker of guilt, the sign of deceit he had been so sure was there. He found nothing. He saw only a woman whose love had been rejected, whose faith had been betrayed. The certainty that had been his shield for days began to feel like a shroud. Doubt, a tiny, insidious seed, had been planted in the barren ground of his conviction. And in the lonely, silent nights of his castle, it had begun to sprout. He summoned Lord Valerius to his private study. The courtier arrived, preening, his face a mask of obsequious concern. He was the one who had brought the first report, the sighting in the market. Cale watched him, his ancient eyes missing nothing, the slight sheen of sweat on the man's brow, the way his gaze darted around the room, avoiding the king's. "Tell me again," Cale said, his voice dangerously soft. "Tell me what you saw." Valerius launched into his story, embellishing it this time. Ilara's laughter had been flirtatious, her touch on the envoy's arm lingering, intimate. It was a clumsy performance, and with the first tendrils of doubt already wrapped around his mind, Cale saw it for what it was. A lie. A poorly constructed, self-serving lie. He let Valerius finish. Then he leaned forward, his hands flat on the polished surface of his desk. "The human envoy," Cale said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He is 60 years old. He has a wife and 4 grown children. And his left arm was amputated at the elbow 30 years ago in the Western Wars. So tell me, Valerius," he continued, the softness in his voice hardening into steel, "which arm did she touch?" The color drained from Valerius's face. The courtier's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The lie had collapsed, and he was buried in the rubble. Cale didn't need a confession. He could see the truth in the man's panicked eyes. It had all been a fabrication, a petty power play by a sycophant who thought he was giving the king what he wanted. And the most damning part was, he had been right. The king had wanted it. He had been hungry for a reason to push her away, to retreat back into the safety of his solitude. He had welcomed the poison and drunk it down with relish. The hollowness in his chest became a searing, agonizing burn. The victory he had claimed was the most profound defeat of his entire existence. 3 weeks had passed. 3 weeks since she had walked out of the castle and into the rain. Ilara had journeyed south, walking until her feet were blistered and her body ached with a weariness that went deeper than muscle. She had sold the only thing of value she possessed, a small, simple gold locket her mother had given her, for enough coin to carry her further, to a place where the king's shadow could not reach. She found herself in a small, sleepy town nestled by a river, a place of cobbled streets, leaning timber-framed houses, and the constant, comforting smell of baking bread. She found work at the town's bakery. The owner, a stout, flour-dusted woman named Marta, had looked at Ilara's soft, uncalloused hands with skepticism but had seen a quiet desperation in her eyes that she recognized. She offered Ilara a small room above the shop and a pittance of a wage in exchange for sweeping floors, scrubbing pans, and serving customers from dawn until dusk. Ilara accepted without hesitation. The work was hard, physical, and blessedly mindless. Her hands, once accustomed to the soft touch of silk and the weight of silver cutlery, became raw and chapped. Her back ached. Her fine court gowns were a distant memory, replaced by a simple, patched linen dress. And yet, there was a strange peace in the exhaustion. In the castle, She had been an ornament, her days a series of carefully curated, beautiful moments. Here, she was a necessity. She was the one who stoked the oven in the pre-dawn chill, the one who wiped down the sticky tables, the one whose tired smile was the first thing the townspeople saw in the morning. She was no longer defined by who she was to the king. She was defined by the work of her own 2 hands. She was learning to be just allure again. The loneliness was a constant companion, a dull ache that sharpened in the quiet moments. At night, in her small, plain room, she would lie on her lumpy straw mattress and listen to the sounds of the town settling down. She would stare out her small window at the moon, a silver coin in the black velvet sky, and wonder if he was looking at it, too. Did he ever think of her? Did he feel a moment's regret, or was he content in his cold, unshakable certainty? The pain of his betrayal was a wound that refused to close. Sometimes it would ambush her in the middle of the day, the scent of a certain flower, the sound of a man's low laughter, a glimpse of a dark-haired stranger, and she would have to retreat to the back room, her breath catching in her throat, until the wave of grief subsided. But there were also moments of unexpected grace. The warmth of the bakery in the morning, the earthy smell of rising dough. The shared smiles with Marta over a cup of weak tea at the end of a long day. The small children who would press their faces against the shop window, their eyes wide with delight at the sight of the sweet buns. These were small, simple, human things. They were a balm to her wounded spirit. She was slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding a life from the rubble of the old one. She was learning that survival was not just the absence of death, but the quiet, determined act of finding a reason to greet the morning. One afternoon, a man entered the bakery. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and he moved with a stillness that was jarringly out of place among the bustling townspeople. He wore a simple, hooded traveler's cloak, but Ilara knew him instantly. It was Rhys, the captain of Cale's personal guard. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic, trapped bird. Had he come for her? Had the king sent his hunter to drag her back? She froze behind the counter, her hands gripping the wooden edge. Rhys lowered his hood. His face was grim, his eyes, usually so calm and steady, were etched with worry. He did not look at her as a fugitive. He looked at her with a deep, weary sadness. "Lady," he said, his voice low, for her ears only. "I am not a lady," she replied, her own voice tight, strained. "My name is Ilara." He nodded, accepting the correction. "Ilara. I am not here on the king's orders. In fact, he would have my head if he knew I had come." Her fear subsided, replaced by a wary confusion. "Then why are you here?" "To see that you were safe," he said simply. "And to ask you to consider returning." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Returning? To what?" "To my cage. To the man who looked at me as if I were something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe." Rhys flinched at her words. "He was wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The accusation, it was a lie. The courtier confessed. The king knows." Ilara stared at him, the information washing over her not with relief, but with a fresh wave of anger. So, he knew. He knew he had shattered her, shattered them, for nothing. For a courtier's pathetic lie. And he had not come himself. He had hidden in his castle, stewing in his pride, and sent a soldier to do his bidding, or rather, a soldier had come against his wishes. The insult was profound. "And what of it?" she said, her voice trembling with a cold fury. "Does he think his knowledge changes anything? Does he think the truth is a key that can unlock a door he himself bolted and barred? Trust is not a tapestry that can be rewoven once it's been torn to shreds, Captain. It is glass. And he smashed it." "He is not well," Rhys said, his gaze pleading. "The castle is a tomb. He is a ghost within it. He does not eat. He does not speak. He just exists. This mistake is consuming him." For a flicker of a moment, she felt a pang of her old tenderness. The image of Cale, alone and suffering, was a hard one to bear. But she smothered it. Her compassion had been the weapon he had used against her. She would not hand it to him again. "Suffering is the price of his pride," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He built his own prison, Rhys. I will not be the one to hand him the key. Tell him nothing. Tell him you did not find me. Let him remain in his tomb. It is the one he chose." She turned away, presenting him with her back, an echo of the way she had left the throne room. She began wiping down the counter with a cloth, her movements jerky and fierce. She heard Rhys hesitate, then the soft sound of his footsteps as he turned and left the bakery. The bell above the door chimed his departure. Only when she was sure he was gone did she allow her body to slump, her forehead resting against the cool wood of the counter. The tears she had refused to shed for Rhys, for Cale, for herself, finally came, silent and scalding. He knew. And it changed nothing at all. The confession of Lord Valerus had been a stone dropped into the still, dark pool of Cale's self-deception. The ripples spread outwards, shattering the perfect reflection of his righteous anger and revealing the monstrous, prideful creature that lay beneath. He had not been a king defending his honor. He had been a coward, terrified of a love he felt he did not deserve, and he had used the first, flimsiest excuse to destroy it before it could destroy him. In the days that followed, the castle became his prison. The ghost of Alara was no longer a quiet, haunting presence, it was a screaming poltergeist. Her absence was in the very taste of the air, thin and sterile. The silence was no longer his domain, but hers a testament to what he had lost. He would walk the halls and see her everywhere. A phantom of her curled in a window seat, reading. A shimmer of her in the garden, tending her herbs. A whisper of her laughter on the wind. He was the one who was haunted now, and his tormentor was his own memory, his own profound, irredeemable failure. He had Valerus stripped of his titles and lands, banished to the desolate northern wastes. He had Lady Serafina, who had gleefully corroborated the lie about the scarf, confined to her chambers indefinitely. The punishments were swift and brutal, the acts of a king restoring order. But they brought him no satisfaction. Punishing the liars did not absolve the man who had been so eager to believe them. The rot had not been in his court, it had been in him. One night, nearly a month after she had left, he found himself standing before a long, gilt-framed mirror in his chambers. He stared at his own reflection. He saw the vampire king, the immortal monarch, the creature of power and shadow. But for the first time in centuries, he saw the artifice of it all. The stern expression, the rigid posture, the cold, unreadable eyes, it was a mask he had worn for so long he had forgotten he was wearing it. Alara had seen past it. She had seen the lonely man beneath the crown, the boy who had carved a wooden bird, and she had loved that man. And he had sacrificed him on the altar of the king. He could not stay here. He could not rule a kingdom when his own soul was in anarchy. The crown felt heavy as a millstone on his head, the throne cold as a grave. He summoned his council, a group of ancient, pragmatic vampires who had served him for centuries. His announcement was brief and left no room for argument. He was ceding governance to them for an indeterminate time. He was leaving. They were stunned into silence. Where was he going? For how long? He offered no explanations. He simply turned and walked away, leaving them in the council chamber to grapple with the unprecedented abdication. He went to his chambers and stripped himself of his royal finery. The embroidered silks, the polished boots, the signet ring of his office, he left them all behind. He dressed in the simple, durable clothes of a traveler, dark wool trousers, a plain tunic, a heavy, hooded cloak. He took no weapons, save for a simple hunting knife at his belt. He took no money, no jewels. He would be Cale, not the king. His journey began before dawn. He left the castle not through the main gates, but through a small, forgotten postern gate used by gardeners, the same one Alara had sometimes used to slip out into the woods unseen. The act felt fitting. He was shedding his own skin, leaving the monarch behind. He did not know where he was going. He knew only that he had to move, that to stay still was to let the poison of his regret consume him entirely. He found himself walking south. His instincts, honed over a millennium, pulled him in a direction without conscious thought. He was tracking her. Not with the supernatural speed and senses of a vampire, but on foot, like a mortal. He walked the dusty roads, slept in barns or in the shelter of forests. He felt the sun, not as a direct threat under which he would burn, but as a warmth on the horizon at dawn and dusk, a phenomenon he had only ever observed from behind thick castle walls. He felt the gnawing ache of a hunger that was not the sharp, demanding thirst, but a simple, hollow emptiness. He hunted small game in the woods, the act of survival grounding him in a way that ruling a kingdom never had. The world was different on foot. It was loud, and messy, and vibrant. He saw things he had never noticed from the back of a royal steed or the window of a carriage. He saw the kindness of a farmer sharing his bread with a stranger. He saw the weariness in a washerwoman's face, and the fierce love with which she hugged her child. He saw the simple, profound tapestry of mortal life, the threads of joy and sorrow, struggle and perseverance, from which Alara had been woven. He had plucked her from this world and demanded she thrive in his sterile, silent one, without ever trying to understand the soil from which she had grown. His journey was a penance. Every blister on his feet, every cold night spent under the stars, every pang of mortal-like hunger was a small payment on an immeasurable debt. He was stripping himself down to his most essential self, hoping that somewhere, beneath the layers of pride and power and centuries of solitude, the man who had carved the wooden bird still existed. He was a pilgrim, and the shrine he sought was not a place of forgiveness, but a place of truth. He needed to see her, not to reclaim her, not to demand she return, but to simply witness the life he had forced her back into. He needed to see the consequences of his actions, to face the reality of the world he had created with his failure of faith. And so he walked south, one slow, penitent step at a time, following the ghost of a memory toward a reckoning he both craved and feared. Cale arrived in the riverside town of Oak Haven at twilight. The place was just as he had imagined from the faint traces of her path he'd followed, small, quiet, unassuming. Smoke curled from the chimneys of the timbered houses, and the warm, yeasty smell of the bakery hung in the air. He stood at the edge of the town square, a tall, cloaked figure in the deepening dusk, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. This was her world now. A world of simple routines, of human commerce, of life measured in loaves of bread and changing seasons. It was a world in which he was an alien, a creature of night and silence in a land of day and noise. He did not seek her out immediately. For 2 days, he watched from a distance. He was a shadow at the edge of the market, a silent observer in a crowded tavern. He learned her new rhythm. He saw her rise before the sun, her form silhouetted in the window above the bakery. He saw her sweeping the steps, her movements tired but steady. He saw her behind the counter, her hair tied back, a smudge of flour on her cheek, offering a small, sad smile to a customer. He saw the townspeople treat her with a casual kindness, an easy acceptance that she had never been afforded in his court. They called her Alara. Not the Lady Alara or the king's consort. Just Alara. She had a name, a self, that was entirely her own. The sight of her was a blade in his heart, twisting with every breath. She was thinner, and there were pale blue shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. But there was also a strength in her posture he had not seen before, a resilience forged in the fires of her new, hard life. He saw her one afternoon sitting on a bench by the river, sharing a piece of bread with Marta, the bakery owner. Alara laughed at something the older woman said, a genuine, unburdened sound. It was the laugh he remembered from the gardens, the sound like wind chimes. And in that moment, he felt a pain so exquisite it almost brought him to his knees. He had not destroyed her. He had, in his own monstrous way, set her free. Free from him, from his suffocating world, from his paranoia. The life she was living was a difficult one, but it was hers. He was terrified. The king who had faced down armies, who had brokered treaties between ancient, warring powers, who had lived for 1,000 years, was utterly, primally terrified. What could he possibly say to her? "I'm sorry" felt like a pebble thrown into a canyon. "I was wrong" was a truth so vast and destructive it seemed unspeakable. He had come all this way, stripped himself of his crown and his pride, but the final few feet that separated them felt like an impossible chasm. To approach her was to risk the one thing he could not bear, the finality of her turning away from him forever. He had already banished her from his home. He could not endure being banished from her sight. On the evening of the 3rd day, he knew he could wait no longer. The sun had set, and the street lamps were being lit, casting pools of soft, golden light on the cobblestones. The bakery was closing. He saw Marta leave, calling a cheerful goodnight. He saw Ilara wipe down the last table, her movements slow with exhaustion. He stood across the street, hidden in the deep shadows of an alleyway, his heart a cold, dead weight in his chest. He watched her as she blew out the lamp in the shop's front window, plunging it into darkness. And then, she looked up. It was not a sudden movement. It was a slow, weary lifting of her head, as if she were feeling the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. But her gaze didn't sweep the street. It moved with an unnerving, unerring certainty, cutting through the twilight, past the carts and the passers-by, and landed directly on the shadows where he stood. She could not possibly see him. He was cloaked, hidden, a creature of the night. But she felt him. After 5 years of living at his side, of being attuned to his unnerving stillness, she knew his presence as a blind person knows the warmth of the sun. The world seemed to halt. The distant sounds of the town, a dog barking, the murmur of voices from the tavern, faded into a dull hum. There was only the space between them, a street filled with the ghosts of unspoken words and unforgivable actions. She did not move. She did not gasp or cry out. She simply stood in the darkened doorway of the bakery, a fragile silhouette against the faint light from the back room, and watched him. Her stillness was not one of fear. It was the stillness of a mountainside before an avalanche. He knew, in that moment, that his pilgrimage was over. He had reached his destination. He stepped out of the shadows and into the soft, unforgiving light of the street lamp. The man who stood across the street was and was not the king she knew. He wore the simple, rough clothes of a common traveler, his cloak dusty, his boots scuffed and worn. The proud, unyielding posture of the monarch was gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out weariness. His face, illuminated by the flickering gas lamp, was a study in anguish. The cold mask of authority had fallen away, and what was left was something raw and unguarded, something she had only seen in fleeting glimpses in the dead of night. He looked like a man who had journeyed through his own personal hell and had come out the other side, scorched but whole. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. Her hand flew to her chest, pressing against the frantic beating of her heart. For weeks, she had imagined this moment in 1,000 different ways. In some, he was furious, dragging her back to his castle. In others, he was imperious, demanding she return. In her most secret, shameful dreams, he was repentant, begging her forgiveness. She had never imagined this. This silent, broken man standing in the middle of a common street, stripped of every trapping of his power, looking at her as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if held back by an invisible wall. The space between them, no more than 30 feet, felt as vast and as dangerous as the throne room had been. Every passing townsperson, every clatter of a horse's hoof, was an intrusion on the deafening silence that had fallen between them. He did not speak. He just looked at her, his eyes, that familiar color of a winter storm, holding a universe of regret. It was the silence that finally broke her composure. It was his lack of demands, his lack of command. He was not the king. He was just Kale. And he was waiting. Waiting for her to cast the first stone, to scream, to run. He was giving her all the power. She found her voice, though it was a thin, reedy thing. "What are you doing here?" The sound of her voice seemed to startle him. He flinched, as if he had expected a blow. He took a slow breath, the air shuddering in his chest. When he spoke, his voice was not the resonant timbre of the king, but a rough, hoarse whisper, scraped raw by disuse or by grief. "I was wrong." 3 words. 3 simple, devastating words that cost him more than his kingdom. They were not an excuse. They were not a justification. They were a confession, absolute and unadorned. He did not say, "I was misled." He did not say, "There was a misunderstanding." He said, "I was wrong." The admission hung in the air between them, stark and terrible and beautiful. Ilara felt the anger that had been her shield for weeks begin to crumble, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. She wanted to rage at him. She wanted to list every sleepless night, every tear she had shed, every callus on her hands. She wanted to make him feel the full weight of the life he had broken. But looking at him now, she saw that he already did. It was etched on his face, in the slump of his shoulders, in the profound emptiness of his eyes. He had already passed sentence on himself, and his punishment was this moment, standing before her with nothing left but his own failure. "Yes," she said, the single word soft but heavy as lead. "You were." He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing her confirmation as if it were a physical strike. When he opened them again, they were shining with an unshed moisture that no vampire should have been able to produce. "I dismantled my own heart, Ilara," he whispered, his voice cracking. "And I used your name as the hammer. I did not trust you. I did not. I couldn't believe that someone like you, someone so full of light, could choose me. Could choose the dark. It was easier to believe in betrayal than to believe in that miracle. It was the greatest failure of my 1,000 years of life." He took another tentative step. He was closer now, close enough for her to see the fine lines of strain around his eyes, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, as if to keep himself from reaching for her. "I don't ask for your forgiveness," he said, his voice dropping lower, thick with a pain that resonated deep in her own bones. "It is not mine to ask for. And I am not here to command you back to a life that was a prison. I am here to see, to witness what I have done. And to say that the man who loved you is still here, buried under the pride of the king. And he is sorry." He stopped, no more than 10 feet from her now. He had crossed a kingdom to find her. Now, he had to cross the few feet of silence that separated them, and that was the most terrifying distance of all. Ilara looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the truth of his pilgrimage. He had not come to reclaim a possession. He had come to face his own soul. The path to reconciliation was not a straight road back to the castle. The life they had there was gone, poisoned at the root. It could never be reclaimed. But perhaps, just perhaps, something new could be planted in the ruins. Something small and fragile, something that would need careful tending. She thought of the glass he had shattered. It could never be made whole again. But perhaps the pieces could be gathered, and, over a great deal of time, with patience and with care, they could be fused by fire into something new. A mosaic, scarred and imperfect, but beautiful in its own way, its strength found in the lines where it had been broken. She did not move toward him. She did not offer him a smile or a touch. The wound was too deep for such easy salves. But she did not turn away, either. She held his gaze, her own eyes clear and steady. "The bakery opens at dawn," she said, her voice quiet but firm in the night air. "The floors need sweeping." It was not forgiveness. It was not an invitation back into her heart. It was a test. A chance. A single, tiny seed planted in the barren ground between them. It was an offer not of love, but of work. The hard, slow, painful work of rebuilding. A tremor went through Cale's body. A wave of relief so profound it was almost indistinguishable from pain. He understood. She was not offering him a throne at her side. She was offering him a broom. And it was the most precious gift he had ever been given. He slowly, reverently, inclined his head. A gesture not of a king to a subject, but of a penitent to his confessor. "I will be here," he promised. And as she turned and disappeared into the darkness of the bakery, leaving him alone in the lamplight, he knew that his journey was not over. It was just beginning. He would sweep the floors. He would learn the rhythms of her new life. He would earn back her trust, one sunrise, one loaf of bread, one shared silence at a time. He had been a king for 1,000 years. Now, he would learn to be a man.